So we're talking about podcasting and what you need for podcasting. You don't need a lot of fancy stuff. You need some sort of microphone. It doesn't have to be fancy. You need something to record to. A computer or a laptop is going to be slightly better than a tablet or a Chromebook. You need some sort of place to record, and a makeshift DIY recording studio in your house works great. A lot of people recorded podcasts in their closets during the pandemic because the clothing in your closet produces a natural sound dampening to improve sound quality. You need some sort of software, and I emphasize Audacity, which is a free tool that can be downloaded to Mac and PCs alike. You need to have your podcast live somewhere on the web, and there are lots of free solutions out there. You can use a website and then create an RSS feed, or you can actually use something like Spotify, Anchor, SoundCloud, or even YouTube. But more than the technology, you need ideas, energy, essential there, and ideally a great team, both to help you produce a podcast, but also to listen to your podcast. It's all about building community. Now, I have already admitted that I am not a podcaster, but I did want to share a little bit of how I engage with podcasting. So I'm a podcast teacher, and I teach podcasting in a variety of ways that we can think of on a spectrum, from truly immersive. We run a week-long virtual institute. It started as an institute for doctoral students, but has since expanded to faculty, where we throw students in on day one. We form them into groups, and by the end of day 5, they have a 20 to 25-minute podcast, and Dispatches from Dystopia was one of those podcasts recently produced. And this is done with the National Humanities Center out in North Carolina. But I also do everything up to one-on-one small group consultations. So I've done workshop series, I've partnered with faculty to come into their class on multiple occasions to do instruction, and I've just parachuted into a class, what librarians like to call one-shot, to help folks get started with podcasting. These are a few examples of recent podcasts produced at our National Humanities Center Podcasting Institute, and you can actually follow out the links to listen to all of them, including the full audio of Dispatches from Dystopia, which is really, truly one of the most experimental podcasts we've ever seen students produce at our institute. But we've had really moving podcasts where students have produced things that have just brought me to tears. Our podcast institutes often fall on the heels of really important moments, like our first virtual institute was right after George Floyd's murder. We had one the week after the insurrection. And our participants really leaned into that, bringing their scholarly expertise to talk about these particular moments in really moving ways. Now, if you're thinking about podcasting in the classroom, I'll offer these tips. The first is why? Why would you want to bring podcasting into the classroom? What are you hoping that your students will get out of it? What are your learning outcomes? And how does podcasting advance that? If you're new to podcasting, or if you're new to teaching podcasting, I really encourage you to scale down to start. You don't have to do everything right away. And as much as you can, try to scaffold everything, and I'll provide an example of that in just a minute. I also really strongly encourage folks to learn how to do it before you ask students to. You might have a lot of support at your institution for podcasting, and if you're at SDSU, you certainly do, but you're going to be the first line of questions when students are struggling. And having a general sense of how to do it is a really great way to help them learn how to do it. Wherever you are, you've likely got a support network in place. And whether you know of a podcasting expert at your campus or not, you likely have one. But I'm also a resource for everybody. So I don't limit myself to SDSU or to the CSU. And finally, you want to tie your assessment of the student podcast to those learning outcomes and that motivation. And you want to share that with them before they produce their podcast, so they know what to expect and how they're going to be evaluated. Now, this is an example of a set of podcasting labs that I developed with a professor at Berkeley last spring. She had been a participant in our institute and asked me to help her scaffold podcasting into a grant-funded class that she was running. So we modeled this scaffolding based on the scaffolding that we offer in the National Humanities Institute, where all of that learning happens in sort of high speed, a couple of days. we did these 6 labs over the course of roughly 10 weeks to get students prepared to produce their own podcast. And we paired each lab with a little mini assignment following the good example set by Elizabeth Pollard about reinforcing that learning. So when I taught them a little bit of recording, they then had to go record like a minute of audio and then have to slowly learn how to edit that and then add additional sounds to that. There's many ways to scaffold podcasting, and it doesn't have to be done over 6 sessions, but there's lots of different ways you can think about doing that, and I can help you think through that. Now, if you're thinking about incorporating podcasting into your research, I would start with the same question. Why do you want to do it? What does it help you do? Why engage in this form of digital storytelling and public-facing storytelling? So to help with that, you have to figure out how it fits into your scholarly identity and how it fits into your capacity. So I'm not talking just about your capacity to produce a podcast, but to produce a podcast on top of everything else, your teaching load, your service load, your personal life, all of those things. Whenever possible, try to find some trusted partners. And again, I would encourage you to scale down. Whenever possible, you can also seek institutional resources and support, not only resources for hosting a podcast or for actually maybe paying students, say, to help with transcription or research, but also to help you get the word out. Because part of what we need to do with podcasting is produce it for a particular audience. You might have a very small niche audience in mind. You might have a very large audience in mind, but your podcast will only go so far as you can get it to your audience. And then thinking about how we make it count. This is something we were talking about in the morning sessions. There are now avenues for peer review of podcasts and other digital projects. The Amplify Podcast Network, which Hannah McGregor launched or is launching, is one such network for engaging in open peer review of podcasts. But reviews in digital humanities and Kairos are also there. And many professional societies are doing this. I've noticed that I think either OHA, the organization of actually, it's a typo, Organization of American Historians or American Historical Association has actually been doing podcast reviews. But while we do that and use these traditional avenues for evaluation, we also want to think about how podcasting can help us blur and break boundaries in our work, to blur the boundaries between research, teaching, scholarship, and service, and community engaged scholarship, and also chip away at the gatekeeping of peer review. There's lots of resources to get you started. The guide to academic podcasting that Hannah McGregor and Stacey Copeland created is fantastic, as well as transom.org and Out on the Wire. And lots of resources here at through the Digital Humanities Center at San Diego State, including tutorials, training materials, and my LibGuide. And I'll put the link to these slides in chat one more time, and you can follow all these links out. My team is available for consults and training. I have a very small team at San Diego State, but I have been training a national team of graduate students who are part of my tech team for the Institute, and I'm training them to actually teach podcasting as well. If you're interested, we've got 2 podcasting institutes coming up, one for grad students this winter. In that case, you need institutional nomination because the institutions actually pay for the grad students to attend. And a faculty one in the summer. Some faculty have to fund themselves and some can get sponsorship through their institution. The institutes are not cheap, but I'm told they are very transformative, intense experiences. And more than anything, you can always reach out to me for questions and help and guidance. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Looks like we have like 3 minutes and 30 seconds for questions.
Sorry, I had a hard time squeezing this down.
Pam, I have a question. I would love to hear, so you've mentioned a couple times about the need to scale down. And I was wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of what that might look like, because I think we all probably have that tendency to be extremely ambitious when we're designing these projects.
That's such a great question, Kylie. There's a couple ways you can scale down. One would be to scale the number of episodes you're thinking about producing. I was meeting with a postdoc the other day who wanted to do 18 episodes and wanted them all done for launch. And I said, well, maybe you should just start with 5 or 10 and then break it into seasons, see how it goes, and then continue going once you get more of a feel for the technology. You can also scale down the length of the episode. A lot of people ask me, what's the ideal length of a podcast? And I say it depends. We all have different listening preferences. Some prefer short, some prefer long. A shorter podcast sometimes is easier to produce. Sometimes it's harder because if you have 2 hours of interview tape, it might be really hard to get that down to 20 minutes. So scaling down the amount of content you're either including in the podcast or the amount of editing you're doing. And you can always refine as you build your skills and scale up as you have that capacity and know-how.
Well, out of my own personal curiosity, I'm pretty like new to all of this DH stuff. So I'm kind of wondering, have you had any challenges with like doing DEI and podcasting? Like, have you had any challenges with getting minority voices heard? And how do you share it out to make sure people are listening to these podcasts, that people's work is getting listened to and all that kind of thing?
Melissa, that's a fantastic question. And one thing I failed to mention is that the institutes were designed to really attract and foster a diverse range of faculty and grad students. So not only students from participants from a broad set of backgrounds, but who engage in scholarship around questions of intersectionality, race, environmental justice, things like that. And because of that, a lot of the frameworks that they bring to their podcasting sort of inherently have that kind of lens to it. And so they're producing really thoughtful, cutting edge scholarship in digital ethnic studies, in a variety of interdisciplinary things. And then to Elizabeth's question about, Beth's question about auditory abilities, we do encourage transcription, and not just a word-for-word transcript of the podcast, but an actual well thought out and well-designed transcript that is designed with the podcast. And one of the examples linked in the slides, Lost in Transcription, actually covers that. So the students actually talk about how to design a podcast transcript that is not only accessible, but is in and of itself something that can be engaged with. And so that would be the way that we would engage in accessible podcasting. That's the one real, limitation with podcasting. And if we don't do things like that, it's sort of the equivalent of alt text and other things. We limit our audience that way.
That's awesome. Okay, we're going to move on to Kylie. Kylie Sago, who is going to talk more about DH languages. Kylie Sago holds a PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Harvard University. Her research and teaching center on colonialism and French literature in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her current projects examine literary adaptation, racialization, and abolitionism.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. I'm rusty with Zoom all of a sudden. I want to thank Christina and Pam for the invitation to talk with you all today. And before I begin, just acknowledge that as I talk about this project on abolitionist literature from the early 19th century in France, and I show my process for working with archival manuscript documents, I show images of the documents that do include racist language from that time. So in this talk, I'll give an overview of a part of my research centered on abolitionist literature from the early 19th century in France, talk about the digital tools I use, and discuss future forms the project might take. I'll start with a little bit of background. So France was the first Western imperial power to abolish the slave trade and slavery, and the only one to overturn that abolition. So after France banned the slave trade for the second time in 1815, certain intellectual societies around France called academies held poetry contests to commemorate that abolition. And by this point in the early 19th century, academies had been hosting poetry contests for well over 150 years. Individuals would send in poems, which were evaluated by small juries, and winning entries might be revised and printed and published in print form. But many of these submitted poems to academic contests exist only as manuscripts and are conserved in archives around France with varying degrees of accessibility to researchers. So while conducting research in France in 2019, I identified different poetry contests with abolitionist themes, and I visited archives in different cities to photograph the documents with the plan on working on them in the future. I started transcribing the documents in earnest in summer of 2021, and starting in fall of that same year, I was assisted by SDSU graduate students, Diana Jimenez and Marisa Ailey, whose transcription work and collaboration on this project I very gratefully acknowledge. So now I will take you through the tools. I'll take you through the process of setting up this project, which began with the choices I made around the particular tools that I would use. And I'm going to start with two tools that I initially considered, but ultimately found were not the best fit for this particular project. So initially I used Tropy. Let's see, I use this actually all the time for my own personal organization of research photos and the transcription process. And I'm showing a video, a screen grab of one of my Tropy projects. And this is a wonderful open source software that is very useful for the organization, processing, and transcription of images of archival materials. The software allows you to group different images into objects. So you can take all of the images of one document and group them together. You can add metadata for the document, keep track of the the location in the archive, for example, and you can also add tags to allow you to sort of track links between the different documents you're working with. And it's fabulous for transcription in that it allows you to manipulate the appearance of an image that you've taken without touching the original file, which minimizes the risk of file corruption. But unfortunately, Tropy does not currently support multi-user collaboration. So when I started working with graduate students on these transcriptions, I knew that I would need to find a different option. So I seriously considered Transcribus, which is a platform for the transcription of historical documents that does support collaboration between team members. It also intriguingly has the potential to use AI text recognition of handwriting and the generation of a machine transcription, which would frankly save hundreds of hours of labor. That's available as a desktop application, or it's also available on a web browser. You can see here on my slide, there are a lot of different models of handwriting recognition that you can adopt, or you can train your own for the particular set of documents you're working with. It's free to use except for that automatic text recognition, which comes out to about 15 cents a page. But because of the nature of the particular documents I'm working with, and specifically the fact that they're relatively short documents and I'm working with a large range of handwritings, I decided that it would ultimately not be worth using the automatic text recognition, especially in that I would probably have to train the model, and I would be training models for each individual document. And by that point, you would be well on your way to transcribing it entirely by yourself. And additionally, I would need to train my graduate students to use this program, which is not necessarily something they might ever need to do again. And so in deep discussion with Pam, I found a different workflow. So the workflow that I ultimately ended up using is Google Drive. So here's a video of my Google Drive organization. I use a system of Google Drive folders, sheets, and documents for transcription. And again, all credit to Pam Lach for suggesting this workflow. And so I have a Google Sheet that was just shown that is a sort of gives a broad snapshot of the whole project with notes about the individual poems and shows the transcription status of the poems. And then there are also a series of nested files which house the images I've uploaded of the documents, as well as a Google Doc that houses the transcription. And I can log in and check my graduate students' work. I can upload my own transcriptions that then I can ask my graduate student to go through and verify. And this has been a really wonderful, really wonderful workflow that I would highly recommend to anybody who's embarking on a project like this. Another tool that I found extremely useful is Voyant, which I've used for preliminary textual analysis and visualization. And it's been very useful. I've used it so superficially so far, but even in this extremely superficial use, the quantitative sense it's given me of this project has been extremely helpful for communicating sort of the scale of these documents and the project itself to other people. So for instance, when I say I work on abolitionist poetry, I think there is a tendency maybe to think of a 14-line sonnet form. You know, there's an idea that some of these poems, these texts might be quite short, but the particular poems I work on are sometimes over 20 pages long. And 12 poems that were submitted to one of these 19th century contexts alone total over 23,000 words, which is the equivalent of a 40-page single-spaced block of text with the line breaks removed. So it gives a sense, it helps me communicate sort of the scale of the project and the nature of these historical documents as well to various audiences. So to date, my research team and I have transcribed all 12 poems submitted to one of these projects, one of these academic contests in the early 19th century. And I presented initial findings in a conference paper, which I am in the process of publishing as a journal article. And there are an additional 53 poems from a different, slightly later academic poetry contest. And so far we have completed the transcription of 13 of those poems. And to give a sense of the time investment required for this project, I would estimate that the transcription of the 25 poems we've completed so far has taken probably a combined 200 hours of my and my graduate students' time. So with 35 poems remaining, this gives a sense that I'm not quite halfway through the initial phase of this project. So it's going to be some time yet. But I am nevertheless thinking towards the future directions for this work. So in addition to my own analysis of these poems in conference papers or journal articles, I'm very seriously considering editing these poems into an anthology of some form. And availability for availability's sake is not a sufficient reason to publish archival texts. But I do think that the challenges of these materials and their interest to a range of audiences may make such an anthology useful. I've gestured to some of the challenges so far already, which include the access to the documents in the first place, some of which are held in archives in France with extremely limited availability. Access challenges are exacerbated by pandemic-related restrictions to travel and closures. And to even begin to work on these materials, as we can see from the 200 hours of time that have probably been poured into this project so far, to even begin to work with these materials requires a huge investment in time and labor. And a background in paleography is needed for the transcription. Knowledge of abolitionist texts and political movements is additionally necessary to understand them. So I think in light of all of these factors, these are really interesting, unique archival materials that give insight into the perceived social utility of literature in the 19th century, as well as public understandings of abolitionist discourses. These documents challenge a prevailing idea that there is a very limited public engagement with abolitionism, especially in the French context. And therefore, I think they would be of interest not only to literary scholars like myself, but also to historians. So as I consider the possibility of an anthology, I'm thinking about its potential form. There are certain French publishers that offer series devoted to editions of works of literature related to colonialism, and pursuing publication of an anthology with one of these series would no doubt ensure the visibility of these documents for interested researchers, both in France and in the United States. But I'm really interested as well in exploring the affordances of a digital project, including publishing translations in English to make these texts more accessible to a wider range of scholars and also students. It would also allow me to incorporate digital tools for textual analysis, including timelines or mapping, for instance, of where the contestants in these poetry contests lived when that information is available. And the pedagogical applications of digital projects like this have recent precedents. For example, in a project called A Colony in Crisis, which published translations of primary sources related to a grain shortage in colonial Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And this digital project is actually featured in the same edition of Debates in the Digital Humanities as Jessica Pressman's and Pam Lach's essay on the DH initiative at SDSU. So for now, the transcription process continues, and it will happen for a while, but thank you so much for this chance to share my research process with you all.
Very cool. Thank you, Kylie. That was very interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Hope and John says those tools are amazing. Thanks for making me aware of them.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the tools because I think Kylie's work is a really great example of how finding the right tool to fit the project is the most important thing. And it's not about finding a so-called fancy tool with bells and whistles, but finding the thing that works for the team and facilitates the work. And Kylie, the system that you set up in Google just looks fantastic and really usable for both you and your students. And the fact that they don't have to learn a new tool, they can just jump right into the work, makes a lot of sense. I will say somewhat ironically, we will be making Scripto, which is a transcription tool, available sometime this spring. We've been testing it, and so we will actually have a formal transcription tool that allows for collaboration. But I think your system is fantastic, and it works so well that I see no reason to use Scripto.
Well, there are some limitations to the system, to be totally frank. For example, the things that I most like about Tropy, the ability to change the way an image looks, to sharpen it, to invert the colors, to manipulate the contrast, which makes transcription of sometimes really difficult documents to read. It makes it so much easier. I can't do any of that in Google Drive. And so I do think in some ways it probably slows our transcription process down somewhat, but I think, so I will be very excited to explore the affordances of Scripto, but it's a very good, it's a really great sort of baseline tool. And if there are documents that my graduate student is not able to work on in Google Drive, I can just go do it myself in Tropy. We can always find workarounds and solutions to this.
I was just going to say, I don't have a question. I'm not going to be that I have a comment thing, but I just have to say, I find this so invigorating to hear the kind of work that Pam is doing with the podcasting and Kylie with the working through these different kinds of texts using these different softwares. I feel like I need to rein myself in. There's so many great projects, so many things to do, and Pam knows me. I love doing new things. So the two of you, it's only 3 minutes, but maybe there's a question here. What advice do you have to people who just get excited about the possibilities, not of the tool, but of what the tool makes possible?
I can get started with that. I think one thing is to create space to play, right? So you can experiment with a tool without it leading to anything or being tied to a specific project. And, Beth, you've done that for years, largely in a pedagogical sense. But we can do that in a low stakes kind of way. And then we can also give ourselves permission to put things to the side and say, down the road, I'll think about that, but maybe not right now.
Just to build off of what Pam was just saying, one thing that I'm thinking about as an early career researcher, early on the tenure track at SDSU, I also have to think about sort of what are the types of projects that are valued by and legible to the institution. And so to be honest, I don't know if this anthology is going to come out anytime soon. I think this might be something that I need to reserve for a couple of years down the line. But to speak to Pam's point about play, I am the type of person who just loves the tools. I love I don't know why it's always really spoken to me. I love playing around with different workflows for my personal research. And then I have all sorts of little side projects that I use to learn the tools themselves, but I always find applications for them. I'm always talking to my students about them or telling a colleague, and even if it doesn't find immediate application in my own work, it still adds richness to my life in a way that I will just never give up. So I think it's fun. I like this. Yeah, the idea of sandboxes or play, I think is a great thing for us to adopt.
Well, with 1 minute and like 18 seconds left, it keeps going down. Any other questions? Maybe a quick question for both you, Pam and Kylie. What do you find most challenging about what you're working on? Or what do you find most challenging about the projects that you're working on right now for digital humanities?
I could start off.
Okay, maybe not a quick question.
Oh, no. Mine, just the time scale. I mean, I've never worked on a project. Well, I guess maybe I have worked on projects that take a long time, but this feels like a different order of sort of slow progress, really chipping away at a thing that's going to take truly years to realize. It's an interesting thing, but I think the collaboration element of that makes it, I don't know, bringing new students on board, sharing the work with others, having conversations like this, it makes it really enjoyable at the same time.
I would love to build on that and say that one of the things we really emphasize in our Podcasting Institute is to let go of perfection and just try to experiment and try things out and focus on the process. And that's where the sort of play comes in. Oh, and I see
I guess we have to go now.
We're
Thank you so
moving.
much. Appreciate both of you.
Thank you.